Happy Friday, everybody, and thanks for joining us for our Progress Texas Happy Hour. Today we have Diana, Glenn, and Wesley. And to all three of you, thank you so much for joining us today to give our viewers all this great information. As always, let's start off with our icebreaker. So in about 5 days, Joe Biden's administration will take over at the White House. What are you most excited for as we look into what the Joe Biden administration will provide for Americans?
Well, for me, I think in general, something that I have really wanted to see is some sort of like immigration reform, a path to citizenship for a lot of folks here, especially those that have been, essential workers that, like, even without being essential workers, it's deserved to have a path to citizenship. But especially now in these times. But then also selfishly, I'm on the lookout for any type of student loan possibility of relief.
Yeah, so in the direction that Diana was going, I'm excited for a lot of stuff, but I'm super excited to see what happens as far as education. Student loan forgiveness would be crazy helpful for a lot of people, including me. But just a few, in general, I'm just excited for competent people to be taking over all of these different departments and systems, especially when it comes to the COVID response. We have not had competent people in leadership for the last 4 years. And I would say in general, that's what I'm most excited for.
Yeah, I agree with that, Wesley. And I would say that my top, really looking forward to two things: a truth teller, somebody that speaks the truth from the White House, and also someone with care and empathy and goodwill towards America and Americans, instead of ill will and malice and lies, which we've had for 4 years. I'm looking forward to this refreshing change.
Absolutely. And, I agree with all those things. And on a lighter note, I'm also glad that a dog will finally be back in the White House. And I'm definitely going to tune in for the inauguration for his pup. And Brian on Facebook, thanks for joining us. We're super excited to have you here. Same with Roxy. Okay, so what are we talking about? Today's first thing, impeachment proceedings. Wesley, do you want to catch us up on what's been happening?
Yeah, so a lot happened this week. I'll kind of just give the rundown. So on Wednesday, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Donald Trump for a second time. This was just 1 week after the attack on the U.S. Capitol that resulted in 5 deaths last week, including the death of a Capitol police officer. So the articles of impeachment really lay out the reason for Trump's impeachment pretty clearly. They say the House charging Trump with high crimes and misdemeanors for inciting violence against the government of the United States. And I think that pretty much summarizes exactly what happened last week. The impeachment was historic for a lot of different reasons. So for one, this was actually the first time in our nation's history that a president has been impeached twice. We've only had 4 impeachments now in US history. So now Trump accounts for half of all of the impeachments that have happened, which is just a crazy thought. A couple of other reasons it was historic, though, is because it was the most bipartisan impeachment in U.S. history, which I know sounds kind of strange because only 10 Republicans voted for it, which is a really small percentage of the Republicans in the House. But in the past, the impeachments haven't had that much bipartisan support. And one of those Republicans actually included Liz Cheney, who's the 3rd ranking Republican in the House. So that was a pretty huge deal that happened this week. And it was also the first time in our history that one party voted unanimously to impeach. So every single impeachment in the past, the parties have not actually had unanimous votes amongst their members. But for the first time this year, the Democratic Party voted to impeach Trump. So lots of history was made this week, and it's been a crazy couple of weeks.
I've heard some rumors that he might make history as the first U.S. president to be in the Guinness Book of World Records, and that is something he can put that feather in his cap and be super happy about it. Diana, we've been hearing from a lot of Republicans that impeachment is more divisive. Why do you think it's so important that we hold Trump accountable for what he did?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of us have seen calls to come together, and honestly, from the other side, to say let's just get over it and move past this and get together. But accountability is so important. A part of accountability is justice, is some sort of repercussions for these actions. We can't move past this and get over it without there being repercussions to the horrible thing that Donald Trump incited. We need to set a precedent. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. We have seen throughout history, how when folks get away with attempted coups, they continue to go towards it, especially if there is no punishment. And so if our country can heal, if there is a path to that, it has to include accountability.
Couldn't agree more. And Glenn, what happens next? So the House voted to impeach. What's next?
Well, first on that, just the impeachment itself, I would agree with what's been said. And when I add, I can recall going through the Watergate investigation. Of course, Nixon resigned before he was impeached, but the events that caused that were often called by defenders of Nixon a third-rate burglary. This is a armed insurrection of the U.S. government. If that's not an impeachable offense of a president, I have no idea what could be. Now, what happens next? I noticed a little quirk in the law where the timing of the impeachment articles to be sent to the Senate, I think Pelosi has to look out for that because there's one sort of timing, which means it happens the very day of the inauguration on the 20th, the Senate trial, that is. So they've got to figure out a way beyond that. It's now looking like a Senate trial will take place after Biden is inaugurated. And the Democrats are in charge. And I think the Republicans might try to exploit that for partisan reasons and sort of forget what just happened, a bipartisan vote for impeachment in the House. Right. Maybe try to make it even more partisan sounding in the Senate. I think the most important thing that could come out of it, frankly, would be the lifetime ban on Trump ever holding office again under the 14th Amendment. And so I'm watching for a movement on that as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of it, Glenn, is that's kind of what people are saying. A lot of people are like, oh, it's pointless because he's already going to be out of office by the time if they were to vote to convict. But it's not just about convicting him and holding him accountable. It's like all of these other benefits. He could potentially run for office again in 4 years. He continues to get taxpayer money for a lot of different things because he was a previous president, and that's just one of the benefits that previous presidents get. So that could potentially be stripped from him as well. There's a lot of different things that we can do to hold him accountable when it comes to the Senate convicting him. One other thing that I will add really quickly is something that Diana mentioned, which was about setting the president down the line about what we do to presidents who go against the Constitution and really break their oath of office. And one thing that we said in our statement on Wednesday, Progress Texas released a statement about the impeachment, was that the actions that took place last Wednesday, the coup attempt and the violence that took place at the U.S. Capitol, those will be in our nation's history books for years to come. But what also needs to be in the history books is the response to it and the accountability that came from it. And it doesn't matter whether Trump only has a few days left in office, 20 years, 100 years down the line, people who are studying this history need to see that something was done about his actions and he wasn't able to just get away with it. Otherwise, it'll happen again.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And just imagine if in 4 years he runs for president and he's escaped any accountability for what he did. What kind of person will he be then? And what will be it's amazing. Wesley, if you're a Texan and you are appalled at what happened, what can you do to try and hold Trump accountable as an everyday citizen?
Yeah, so we actually have a petition right now that our people can go and sign, and it basically sends a message to representatives in Congress and also Senator John Cornyn saying that Trump needs to be convicted in the Senate. I think Sotvic will be posting that in the comments. And it also calls for Senator Ted Cruz, to be, what is the term that we're saying? To not evict, is it evicted? Yeah, to be evicted from the Senate as well by his fellow senators. Because Cruz was a huge part of this plot against our government as well. He helped incite this violence, and so he needs to be held accountable and removed from office.
Absolutely. So, a little known thing happened this week. Texas legislative session came back into play. And of course, it's been overshadowed by so much that's been happening in DC. But let's switch gears a little bit and talk about what's going on in Texas itself. Wesley, do you want to kick us off with a little bit of an update of some of the new rules that are coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about a few things that happened this week. For one, the first week of the legislative session is like a lot of traditions take place. It's not really much legislative action that's actually going on. So the week tends to focus on rules that the House and the Senate will abide by in the coming months of the session. One of those rules specifically is a rule about how many people it takes to bring legislation to the floor, how many votes it takes, or how many members of the House or the Senate have to agree for legislation to be brought to the floor. And so as a result of the 2020 election, Republicans lost their supermajority in the Texas Senate. And under previous rules in former sessions, that would have meant that they needed approval from at least one Democrat in order to bring a bill to the floor. So they lost their supermajority, meaning that they would have had to work with the other party in order to bring legislation to the Senate floor. But this week, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick changed the rules so that a supermajority is no longer needed for Republicans to bring bills to the floor. And so that means that they don't have to work with Democrats. This is actually not the first time he's done this. He's also changed the rules in the past whenever the Republicans lost power in the Senate so that he could make it to where only Republicans were needed to decide on this, on bringing bills to the floor. So this was just another way for our Republicans in the Texas Senate to circumvent democracy. You know, Texas voters came out and voted in mass in this previous election. We had the highest turnout ever in history, and they voted for a Democratic senator to replace a Republican senator, which led to Republicans losing their supermajority. So this is just a way for Dan Patrick to give his party more power when Texans actually voted for his party to have less power. You know, Texans voted for them to actually work for people to reach across the aisle and for our lawmakers on both sides to work together to come up with legislation that betters the lives of all Texans. And so he's kind of working around that.
So unfortunate. Glenn, Diane, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Well, it's a sad thing to watch. I mean, I can sort of comically see this getting, you know, the extreme in the future where there's one less Republican next time, so it's lowered to 17, and then there's another one loss, and then it's 16. And how far does it go? Sooner or later, it'll be if the Republicans have their way, if the Democrats have the majority, then the majority can bring a bill to the floor. I mean, it's the reason for the rule in the first place, and it used to be 2/3 of the Senate, so 21 votes were necessary, was that it promoted compromise and comity in the Senate. It wasn't a partisan rule ever. It was intended to get members from both sides working together under the theory that if they'd work together, they'd get better consequences, better bills, et cetera, et cetera. But now it's a totally partisan atmosphere we work in, and the Republicans, especially Dan Patrick, were exploiting that. I expect it, by the way, it'd be especially relevant if a bill on any one of the redistricting bills comes to the Senate. Democrats wouldn't be able to block it because they're vote short. Might also, and I'm sad to say this, on an abortion bill, might also be very relevant. It won't be so relevant on the budget because neither party almost ever tries to block the whole budget bill from coming to the floor.
Just speaking of abortion, Diana, some pretty crazy things happened during this first week. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So yesterday, the House was voting on rules for, you know, in terms of like, folks are mostly concerned about COVID and procedural rules and entering the House and the Senate and entering the Capitol and what both sides would be. And while this was being discussed, Representative Brian Slayton had proposed this amendment saying that, you know, there would have to be a vote on legislation about abolishing abortion before the state could bring up any legislation that would entail renaming roads or bridges. Like, what? You know, we're trying to decide on these other rules. You know, what are you doing? And I think this is just another example of these, you know, opportunistic ways of trying to, you know, we're talking about procedures on protecting, you know, public health and safety measures in COVID, and now you're attacking healthcare, abortion care, and trying to, you know, abolish it or something. It just had nothing to do with what should have been accomplished yesterday. And, you know, Fortunately, the amendment didn't pass, but it was just, a really shocking preview of what's to come in terms of Texans having their healthcare access threatened by the Republicans. And we should keep an eye out at every moment to be able to defend those rights, not just Progress. Texas will be keeping an eye out, but all these other organizations that are working together to defend these rights.
We absolutely have to. And you mentioned COVID, and the fact that we're in a pandemic is kind of changing what's happening at the Texas legislature. And some of our legislators are already getting sick, including Glenn, one of your friends. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Representative Joe Desoto, a longtime friend, great guy, tested positive and announced it late last night or this morning. Of course, they had the big opening day ceremonies. Probably, under the rules, the most crowded day that they'll have for a while in the Capitol. I'm afraid a lot of people were exposed to Joe just in the natural course of the day. So many we've heard from friends, even some reporters, having to go into quarantine under the CDC guidelines just because they had close personal contact with Joe. I wish him well. He's a really great guy, been there a while, affable, hardworking. And I hope that he'll be okay. But I think this will just be the first of many such incidents when really the pandemic is raging, and it's worse than it's ever been. It's more dangerous than it has ever been. And I think there's a strong possibility that the legislature won't continue under the current plans and procedures because of the dangers presented by the pandemic. We'll have to wait and see.
Like you said, we wish Representative Desoto all the best and a healthy, speedy recovery. Before I move to Wesley for a question, Glenn, you've written a lot about what you think it'll take for our country to overcome this pandemic. And it's all, whenever I read that blog of yours, it always gives me so much heart and hope. Do you mind sharing a little bit of that with our viewers?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's in our hands. All right. And it's there's really not going to be obviously, with the Trump administration, no magic bullet solution is going to be put forth. We're going to have to do it ourselves. I pay a lot of attention to what our local officials in Texas are doing, like Lena Hidalgo in Harris County and officials here, and Judge Jenkins in Dallas County. And they've been prohibited from putting in strict enforcement rules, say, on crowd sizes and mask wearing, et cetera. But they continue to implore their citizens to do everything they can. So I can even speak to the libertarian anti-maskers amongst us to reconsider, because wearing a mask is not about you. It's about protecting your own loved ones and your own children and your own parents and your neighbors and your coworkers and your friends. And so if we would take this responsibility, and weren't these conservatives once claiming to be the party of personal responsibility? Well, if they would walk the walk, we could attack this as a people and quit waiting on a single regulation or a law to be passed to save us. It's our responsibility. Let's do it.
I couldn't agree more. And so what we just heard is that even our electeds, when they're going to do their job during the session, they're not even sure how this whole thing will work. And one of the beautiful things about legislative session is Texans get to advocate for what they believe in. Wesley, do you mind sharing how that will be transitioning into 2021?
Yeah, so unfortunately, yesterday the House stripped provisions that were designed to make testimony more accessible by allowing it to be virtual for Texans who would like to testify. This goes against the wishes of so many different advocates who have been pushing for the legislator to have virtual testimony. Just that way, Texans can have access to the legislative process, and they don't have to go in person to the Capitol and risk their health so that they can testify on legislation. So one thing I will say is that every committee chair will have the ability to invite virtual testimony. So Representative Aaron Zwiener actually put up a thread saying, reach out to your representative if you want to testify on a bill, and encourage them, try to get them to ask their committee chairs to invite you to testify so that you can testify virtually. Otherwise, we're going to have to go in person, and that leads to more potential risks for spreading COVID. I know there are specific rules about testing ahead of time and everything, but just know that there are ways to get around this. If you try to reach out to your representative and that doesn't work, you can potentially submit it's not considered written testimony, but it's there's just other system in place where you can kind of provide comments, and it's like linked within the I guess the notes that are taken or the minutes of the testimony on that bill, but it's not given the same weight as testimony. So there are different ways that you can kind of work around it. But as of now, it doesn't seem like virtual testimony for everyone is going to be open. There are just certain ways that you have to get around it. One other thing that I'll quickly add on what Glenn was talking about, this responsibility that we all need to have. Aaron Zwiener was one of the representatives who's now going into quarantine because she was really close to Joe Desoto as well, or Representative Desoto as well. And one thing that she said whenever she posted about, she's going into quarantine, is that she appreciates that he came out and he was transparent about the fact that he tested positive. And that's something that we need all of the lawmakers and really anyone who's going to be in the Capitol during this legislative session. We need for folks to be transparent. There's absolutely no shame in having COVID-19. This is a disease that's impacting so much of our nation. There's no shame in testing positive. But when you do, you need to take care of those around you and let them know so that they can do what they need to do, one, to take care of themselves, but then also to quarantine and take care of their families and their friends and the people around them who could potentially be infected as well with the disease. So I think that that's super important, is this transparency.
100%. And actually, our legislative fellow, Abby Springs, did this is referring back to how you can make your voice heard, created a great guide that I'm going to drop into the comments, 4 ways to have your voices heard during the Texas legislative session. Check it out, because we need to hear your voices as much as possible. Diana, Glenn, Wesley, as always, thank you so much for your expertise and your knowledge and your wit. The people who joined us, we love seeing you here every week, and we'll see you next Friday. Have a great weekend. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.